Halito, and welcome to Native Chalk Talk, a podcast by natives for all. Here we're keeping our Native ancestors' stories and history alive, while also sharing with you our Native culture, traditions, and more. I'm Rachel Youngman, a Choctaw originally from Anadarko, Oklahoma. I hope you'll enjoy this journey with me as we learn from our Native American guests. And I hope you'll do me a favor. Feel free to like and share these episodes. I so appreciate it. Yakuki.
This isn't just a job for me. This is something that I can do to help other kids that were from small towns like me get out in the world and experience different things.
See and share our stories at togetherwe'remore.com.
You're listening to part 3 of this series.
A child is born, it's a male. And what's the life path for that boy, the role of the young boys to the tribe and into their teens?
Yeah. So all the children are reared by the women, usually the moms, and their aunts and their grandmothers are the ones that are raising the children. And once they start getting to a certain age, around like 5 or 6, that's when the boys start being taught by their maternal uncles. So Choctaw kinship is all through the female line. We're a matriarchal society. So the children get their family names and their kinship and their clan through their mother. So if a child, is part of the mother's clan, you wouldn't want it learning from its father because the father's from an opposite clan.
True.
You would want
Okay.
that child to learn from a male that is from the same side of the family as the mother, which is usually her maternal brother or uncle, or some male on her side of the family. And so they may be there every day, they may become certain times of the week because they have their family too that they're providing for. They have their kids and everything, so they may come to that side of the village certain times of the week, or just depending on however they organize that. But that's where they would take them out, and they would do a lot of basically hands-on training on how to get these boys learning to hunt and to work together. So one of the first things, they'd learn to use blowguns like we talked about before, but they also learned how to use rabbit sticks, which are these small clubs that are used to throw and either kill or stun a rabbit. And so you had to be pretty good with them to be able to hit a rabbit while it's still, but also, there's accounts that talking about these young men that could throw it and kill a rabbit that's on the move, which is impressive.
Wow.
Yeah. So it takes a lot of skill and a lot of practice. But, these men would come out and they would teach, these young boys. And so at the ages of 6 and 7 and 8, they're already going out. And depending on the time of year, depends on what the activities for the men are. So during the warm season, there's not a lot of hunting going on because most animals are in their reproductive cycles. There's also worms and other things, parasites. So they would hunt small game, different birds, rabbits, squirrels, stuff like that. And that's what they would provide meat. So during the warm months, the Choctaw diet was mostly plant-based, very vegetarian. But they would supplement a little bit of meat into the diet through these small game, fishing.
Okay.
They were taught fishing too, and either bow fishing. Well, later on, when they got older, they would be taught how to bow fish. But there's different like fishing traps, and there's turkey traps, and there's all these really cool different implements that hunters used. But the other thing is, from a young age, they were taught how to work as a group. So Choctaws fight as a unit, just like our military does. It's not about a single warrior doing a single thing. It's about a group working together, a coordinated group. And so that's how hunting worked. That's how warfare worked. It's all coordinated tactics. And so these boys are learning these different ways of hunting and that sort of thing. And then during like festivals and ceremonies and stuff like that, you'd have some of the older men come and they would teach the oral histories and oral stories. And so a lot of storytelling was used to, help kids at different parts of their life understand the Choctaw world and how things worked and that sort of thing. And so through repetition is how they learned about all the aspects of Choctaw life that they needed.
I assume that for these boys, this must have been a very important experience to be able to not only take care of themselves, but also how to protect their people.
Yeah. I mean, Choctaws were always taught that, everyone has individual freedom. Everyone's allowed to do what they want, but the society still has laws. The community has laws, but there is an obligation that your community comes first. You always put your community and your family first before your personal needs. And so all Choctaw children are taught this during their child rearing. And, that because that's the only way that we can function as a society is we have to put our society first. And that's why all these different roles were really important. But that also goes into decision making too. If you're going to make decisions, you have to think about how these decisions are not going to just affect you. How are they going to affect the tribe for the next few generations? But also, how are they going to affect past generations?
So for a family to have a boy was an important thing. Obviously, you had to have those warriors and the ones that could go out and hunt. And I mean, I know the woman's role was actually extremely important as well, especially back then. Like both of those roles were so crucial. But I would assume that were the boys favored to some degree?
Probably not. We as boys mature a lot slower, so it's a bit harder for. No, that was one thing in Choctaw society is that boys and girls were always favored equally, and we see that in our education system. That later on after the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, with the 40 youth fund. So in the 1840s, we're sending 20 boys to college on the East Coast. We're also sending 20 girls.
That's
There's always
amazing.
equality. Yeah, there's always equality in Choctaw for both sexes, for both roles. And so that was always important. Um,
Great.
Women were tied to the kinship and women had a very strong place in society, but men and women were equal because they both
Yeah.
served a purpose.
There are the boys and then they become teenagers, and I assume it's some time around there that they start trying to get their warrior status.
Mhm. Yeah, so that's when they're going out on hunts, they're going out with war parties, and they're trying to do something that makes them stand out and earn that status as a Tvshka. And so when they go out and then when they come back, there's a defining moment when they're out there that they're finally recognized by their peers. And so when they come back, there's a whole kind of ceremony that's done by the men when they kind of recognize. And during that ceremony is when they're given their warrior name. And that's their new name that they have. And that's when they make that formal transition in Choctaw society. And that's because basically you have all these men that can vouch that, this person is a warrior.
Yeah.
This person has achieved the status and we recognize them. The other thing is too, is that the boys had to show that they could put up with physical hardship. So it's also an endurance test. It's not just proving themselves in bravery or in strategy, but also they had to show that they had the physical endurance as well. And you see that sometimes it's, how long can you hold your breath underwater? How far can you swim? Can you swim blindfolded? Can you keep up with the group? Because part of what it meant when you would, before the men would go out, there'd be a transition. So it's not just, so what would happen is you'd have a war chief and he would send out runners. So his Tvshka Mika Oshi would go out and they would have little bundles of sticks and they would go out and give those to each of the warriors. And that would tell how many days until that warrior had to arrive at the chief's home. And so on that appointed day, all the warriors would arrive to the chief's home. And the war chief would then select which warriors he was going to take. And then that group of warriors, he would choose one of them that would lead the basically the ceremonies before they go to war. So they would lead, we call it the war dance, but there's a longer ceremony that encompasses a lot of those things. And so that next day they would go out to the dance ground, and the families of the warriors would come, and they would do this elaborate kind of war dance. And then they would do other types of war dances and social dances and that sort of thing. And then after that, the men were kept separate for around 3 to 4 days. And that's when they would go through fasting and different purification ceremonies. And so you had to also, these boys had to be able to fast for 3 days, as long as well as, taking these different medicines for purification too. So that's part of some of those hardships, is they had to show they could go through that. In the end, the way that I think about it is, if a warrior comes, this helps show that the warrior is still physically and mentally fit to be able to go to war, because he can, they're around each other, they're gauging each other, is everyone okay? Is everyone meshing well? When you're hungry and you're tired and all these other things, is the unit still working together?
Yeah.
And then after that, then they would go off on their journey. And when they would come home, they would go through the same, a similar ceremony, where they wouldn't come straight back to home. They wouldn't come straight back to their families, but they would come to a place where they could also fast and go through ceremony again, but it was a way to decompress. So the way that I think about it is, instead of just taking them from home to the front, they're going through this process of getting their mind straight before they go to war, but then they're given time to change that thinking. Because if you're in that mode of like fight or flight, you're always, you're out, and you could be attacked at any time. It's different. You have to come down from that before you rejoin their family. It's part of mental health.
Right. You once said to me that it's like our Choctaw people knew how to deal with PTSD.
Mm-hmm. This is also the time that the men would mourn the people that they killed. So part of life is, these men would go out and they would make war, and, they would kill other men, or, other people. But when they came back, they mourn who they killed, because it's still life. They're still people, and they deserve to be mourned, even if it's by the person, that killed them. And that was an important aspect too, where the men would go around in mourning. So part of the Choctaw mourning ceremony is you wouldn't fix your hair, you'd keep it unkept, you wouldn't wash it. And so this one account talks about how they're given little sticks so they could scratch their head. Like,
A little itchy up there because it's so dirty.
yeah, but the account that I've read talks about 30 days, but I think it's whatever that time that's set aside for mourning until you get, until you're done mourning. But
Yeah.
I think that's important, to mourn those that you kill. It's human. It's part of human nature. And I think maybe that's something that could also help our warriors today.
Absolutely. Yeah. What can we take from, again, our ancestors to use today?
We take these things, we take basically the advice of our ancestors, and we revitalize that. How can we apply the same teachings in the past? How can we apply them today to our current world? And so you never want to go back, but you want to take what was laid out by our ancestors and adapt it for the future.
And what worked for them, why can't it work for us? In,
Mm-hmm.
Again, with an adaptation to today's times, for sure.
We'll be back after this quick break. Are you in the medical field looking for your next opportunity? Listeners, I'm proud to introduce you to Native American veteran-owned staffing company, Worldwide Medical Staffing. Owner and CEO Jackson Weaver is a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and is a service-connected disabled veteran where he and his team staff for commercial healthcare and government entities such as the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and DHS, and specialize in staffing Indian Health and VA hospitals nationwide. Isn't it nice to know that our veterans are being cared for by staff who have been handpicked by a veteran who's been in the staffing business for 17 years? Healthcare job seekers, check out these open jobs on www.medical.com. If you're seeking temporary, long-term, or permanent placement of physicians, advanced practice, registered nurses, and more, check out www.medical.com. And Diakoki to our medical professionals and to those who have served our country.
When I think about these warriors, my great-great-grandfather, who only spoke Choctaw, this is him back here. This is his prison photo, so his head was shaved at the time. He once brutally murdered a white man with the last name Kroom along the Kaimichi River in 1896. And Kroom was one of many men my grandfather killed. He was a white man. So I'll spare you the details, but the murder was extremely vicious, and he also scalped the man. So an English translator said that my grandfather gave the reasoning of his committing this murder as revolting against the Dawes Act. Did the Choctaw typically scalp people? I've always wondered that. Because he did in this case.
Yeah, scalping was something that was a part of the warrior society in the Southeast. So it was a way that you could prove your kill. It's by taking a trophy. So usually those that you killed, you would bring back the scalps of men, women, children, that sort of thing. And those were usually displayed over your homes. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so it's, times have changed today. But we did see that Choctaws did scalp during the Civil War as well. And so I think some of that was, the change in society and things that were happening. Some of the men were going back to older traditions to help empower them to be able to fight during the Civil War. And so, that's one of the things that, but the Texas Cavalry also did it too. So there's some aspects of culture that, it's okay to let go to sleep. That may be one of them.
For sure.
Especially, today's time. But
yeah. And even when I was researching what had happened, it actually surprised me when I read about the scalping portion, because I always thought, again, I always think of our Choctaw people as good people and all this stuff. However, even though I thought this story was always horrendous, an elder Kiowa friend of mine told me this was an act of a warrior, and he was doing as his people and his ancestors did. And I think because, again, of the time frame, I didn't initially think of it as a warrior act. But anyway, so side note, Choctaws these days are typically known as being on the shorter side. I know this one was, but were they short back in the earlier time frames we've been talking about?
Yeah, in general, Choctaw men and women are short in stature. But it just depends. It talks about, different Choctaw speaking people, because we had many different communities. Yeah. So like in the Six Towns district, you had the Concha, you had the Chickasahaya and the Yowani, you had the Six Towns group that moved in. And so they talk about the Six Towns being very like short and sturdy people. And then they talk about some of the other groups, being a little bit different. But in the end, it's the concept when it comes to those genetics. There's so much movement in the past. Yeah. So if you're going out, on a trip, because you have to understand, women are the one that are in charge of the family. So if a woman isn't married yet, she can still have kids. So she gets to choose,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So you're still, and then you have, these expeditions where Choctaw men are bringing back different women and children. So, the concept of someone being especially in the past of someone being full-blooded. That's a Western concept that's been applied to Choctaw people today, starting in the 1900s. But people moved all around. We always hear stories about the Osage being extremely tall people, and when Choctaws fighting them, they're almost like giants. But there's variation, in society. We're human, so. But in
Absolutely.
general,
Makes
yeah,
sense.
broad-shouldered, short,
Yeah.
squatty, running
Squatty.
running people,
Yeah.
square feet.
Square feet.
Yeah.
So there was the Choctaw involvement in multiple wars. Let's talk about that. Starting with the Chickasaw Wars, 1721 to 1763, were fought between the Chickasaw, who again were allied with the British, against the French, and the French allies were the Choctaws and the Quapaw and the Illinois Confederation. So would you talk about our rival and intertribal conflicts with the Chickasaws?
Yeah. So it's like starting in the 1690s, we started having conflict, with our brother tribe, the Chickasaw. And there was a period of peace for a little while, and then there was conflict again. So the French were really urging us to war with the Chickasaw. And of course, the French are looking at, total annihilation of like Chickasaw people, just like, when they wiped out the Natchez. We say wiped out. I mean, them as a group, I mean, there were still Natchez people, and they got absorbed in by, other different tribes, and they're still descendants of Natchez people today. So it's not like a tribe is wiped out. It's just their people just go and join other groups.
Mhm.
And so, but the French really did not like the Chickasaw, and like this, and we had conflict with the Chickasaw as well. Early on, there was a period where the Shakshihoma, they're also called the Choctaws, they were a group that spoke. They were related to us and the Chickasaw, and they were in the middle of us. So they were between Choctaws and between Chickasaws. And as neutral ground, they helped initiate peace between our two tribes before the
No
conflict
idea.
with the French. Yeah. And so, because they were looked at, one of our closely related tribes. And so they negotiated that peace between our tribes. Historian Greg O'Brien goes into detail about that, and it's a really cool read. He's got a good journal article that talks about it. I think he talks about it in some of his books too.
Okay.
But later on, some of the young men with the Shakshihoma got a little big for their britches and started raiding Choctaws and Chickasaws for horses and other things. And so we basically turned around and annihilated them and then absorbed their people in. So,
Okay.
Coleman Cole and Robert Cole are direct descendants. They were Choctaw. Coleman Cole was a Choctaw chief, and he was a direct descendant from a Shakshihoma woman. So,
Very interesting.
yeah. So then there was a peace for a long time, but then the issues with the Chickasaw and the French started later on. So, yeah. Then there's this one battle. It's called they call it the Battle of Akia, but it's Hakia, and it's on the Chickasaw Bluffs. So the French wanted to attack the Chickasaw villages, and they mustered this big army, as much as they could get, which wasn't as much in the southeast. So they got this army, and they called upon these Choctaw, this war chief, and all these warriors, and all these Choctaws showed up. And they're like, okay, we're going to storm up this mountain. We're going to attack the Chickasaw. And the Choctaws were like, these aren't the Chickasaw that we're fighting. We're fighting this other group over here. These are the ones that we want to fight. And the French were like, no, Chickasaw evil, kill. And Choctaws were like, nah, we're not doing this. So we stood on the hill and watched the French march up this hill and just get slaughtered by the Chickasaw. So they're going up the hill, and the Chickasaw are in these blockhouses. And so they're shooting with their guns at the French. And when the French get close, they retreat to another set of blockhouses. And then they're shooting downhill at the French. And then when the French advance, then they get up farther. And when the French get too far in, the Chickasaw women flank from the side with these big butcher knives and just cut the French into ribbons. Like, so the women hit them, and then the men charge, and the French retreat, and the Choctaws are just watching all this. Like, we told you, it's a bad idea.
Told you.
Yeah. That
Not
story, of
smart.
course, is greatly paraphrased from the great archaeologist Brad Leib. But yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Oh, that's interesting. They
yeah.
learned their lesson, I bet. Like you said, the Chickasaws were so fierce, and
Mhm,
I didn't even know that until you and I've got to know
mhm,
you more. But I also thought about you talked to me one time about how the Choctaws were already in Indian territory. They were first to come over during the removal, and then eventually the Chickasaws were pretty late. But the Comanche, obviously, the lords of the plains, they were
mhm,
just kind of holy terror throughout Indian territory. And
mhm,
again, it was their area that they had
mhm.
their stomping
Yeah.
grounds for many years. So I get it. But didn't you tell me a story one time about how once the Chickasaws came over, they put them between the Comanche and the Choctaw so they wouldn't keep
Yeah.
wiping out the Choctaw?
I mean, it probably wasn't on purpose, but it happened. So, like when the Chickasaw came over, we gave them land to the west of Choctaw Nation. And so when the Comanche would come raid again, now the Chickasaws are there instead of Choctaws. And so,
Gave them
but
a run for their
they're
money.
yeah, but there was a peace that was done between the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and the Plains tribes. There's a treaty. I forget what the treaty's called, but it was in like the
Really?
1830s or 1840s, somewhere. It could have been as late as the 50s. But yeah, there was a peace that was signed between the federal government and some of the Plains tribes.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, there's a book called Contrary Neighbors, and it talks about a lot of that conflict. I haven't read it yet, but we
Oh
have a
my
copy
gosh,
for
let's
the
put that on our
office.
reading list. We have to read that.
Oh yeah, Contrary Neighbors. Yeah, I've heard it's great, and it goes more into
Okay.
detail about all that's going on in Indian Territory early on.
I mean, I just think it's such a crazy concept that when the government was like, we're just going to move them all to this area we're going to call it Indian Territory and it's going to be fine. They're going to have their land now. It's like you realize you're taking land from another tribe, even though they didn't see land as something you could
Mhm.
buy, but it's still, there were territories.
Mhm.
So it's just a crazy concept to me, especially the ones that were once warring tribes
Mhm.
and then they're putting them right next to each other. Oh, that's scary.
Yeah, there's a lot of conflict. I mean, the government didn't care. The federal government didn't care.
No.
Um,
In fact, they probably were like, let them all kill each other.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, probably at some point. I mean, the U.S. government had treaty obligations to protect us, and that's why they built Fort Washita, was to help protect Choctaws and Chickasaws.
Stay tuned for part 4 of this series.
Thanks for listening to Native Chalk Talk. Be sure to join our community on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and check us out at nativechalktalk.com. Stay tuned for the next episode. You're going to love it. Yakoki. Thank you, my friends.